The bullet hit the wall 3 inches from Emeric Ravencourt's head, and Sophia Orlov did not flinch. She stood at the edge of the enemy checkpoint, her hands raised, her portfolio case clutched against her chest, and she stared down the barrel of a vampire soldier's crossbows, as though she had rehearsed this exact moment 1,000 times in the mirror. Maybe she had. She was an artist. She understood composition, tension, the precise weight of a scene. And this scene, she had decided 4 days ago when she'd heard what the Voss court had done to Emeric, was one she would walk into regardless of the cost. "Human," the soldier said, his white hair pulled back in the severe style of the Voss court's lower guard, his pale eyes moving over her with undisguised contempt. "This is restricted territory. The blood law of House Voss forbids human passage beyond this threshold without an invitation sealed in court wax." "I have something better than a seal," Sophia said. Her Russian accent was calm and flat, the way it always became when she was terrified and refusing to show it. She reached slowly into the front pocket of her portfolio case and produced a single painted card, no larger than her palm, and held it up. "I have a piece of art that your Archon Valdris commissioned from me himself, 18 months ago when the Voss court and the Ravencourt treaty were still in effect. It was never delivered because your court chose to abandon the treaty and leave one of its own guards behind enemy lines to die." The word she used was calculated. Die, not be captured, not be detained. Because everyone on both sides of this border knew what it meant when the Voss court left someone behind. It was not mercy, it was an execution deferred, a punishment dressed in political language, and it had been eating Sophia alive since the moment she had seen Emeric Ravencourt's name on the abandoned list. She had him met once, only once. 7 months ago, at the gallery opening, where she'd premiered her series on the hidden architecture of vampire courts, painted with permission and without apology, because Sophia Orlov asked for permission from no one, but always knew when it was necessary. He had stood in front of her largest canvas for nearly 20 minutes without speaking, a tall figure in a dark coat, his white hair loose around his shoulders, his posture carrying the quiet authority of someone who had learned long ago that he did not need to announce his presence to command a room. She had watched him from across the gallery, pretending not to, and then he had turned, and their eyes had met, and something in Sophia's chest had shifted in a way she had no artistic vocabulary for, which was extraordinary, because she had an artistic vocabulary for nearly everything. They had spoken for 2 hours. He had told her things about the internal architecture of the old Voss court chambers that she had gotten almost right, and the almost that she had gotten wrong, and why. He had not been condescending. He had been precise and engaged, and occasionally, very occasionally, something in his silver eyes had softened into something almost warm, and she had thought, standing there in her paint-stained blazer, that this was one of the most genuinely interesting people she had ever met in her life. She had not known then that the political storm was already building. She had not known that the Ravencourt Treaty, the fragile agreement that had kept Emeric's secondary post in Voss territory legitimate and protected, was already being dismantled from the inside. She had not known that the Voss Archon Valdris had already decided that Emeric's presence on his side of the border was no longer a diplomatic asset but a liability, a symbol of old alliances he wanted to erase. She had found out 4 days ago, when her contact inside the treaty offices had called her in the middle of the night and told her that Emeric Ravencourt had been officially classified as abandoned, that his status as a Ravencourt allied guard had been revoked by his own house under political pressure, and that he was being held in the Voss court's lower detention chambers, which were not a place people came back from easily. Sophia had hung up the phone, sat very still for 30 seconds, and then begun packing. The guard at the checkpoint studied the painted card she was holding. His eyes moved to her face. Something in his expression shifted, not into warmth, nothing as simple as that, but into a calculation. She was human, and humans did not cross into Voss territory voluntarily. That alone made her interesting. And the name Valdris carried weight, even from a human mouth. "You will be searched," he said finally. "I expected nothing less," Sophia said. They searched her thoroughly, took her phone, left her the portfolio case because 2 senior guards examined every canvas inside it and concluded that paint on linen was not a weapon. And then they brought her inside, The Voscourt's primary compound in the city was not a castle, though it wanted to be. It was a converted 19th-century textile factory, 6 stories of black stone and iron. Its windows fitted with light-blocking glass so dark it appeared to be a studded wall from the outside. Inside, the ceilings were high and vaulted, the floors stone, the lighting warm and amber-tinted, designed to mimic firelight. Sophia had painted the exterior from memory. She had never been inside before. She was brought to a waiting room that was also, she understood immediately, a display of power. The furniture was ancient and immaculate. The art on the walls was originals, some of them pieces she recognized from the provenances her gallery contact occasionally shared with her, pieces that had been reported lost or stolen during the border conflicts of the previous decade. She noted each one without touching anything, without letting her eyes linger too long, and waited. Archon Valdris kept her waiting for 40 minutes. She spent them sketching the room from memory, onto the small notepad she'd kept in her coat pocket, which they had not taken, because they had not searched her coat with enough care. She was nearly done with the third-angle study when the door opened. Valdris was older than Emeric, ancient in the way that vampire aristocracy sometimes was its age, not as frailty but as accumulated weight. He was taller than she expected, his white hair cropped close at the sides and long on top, his eyes a pale, almost colorless grey that reminded her of winter sky just before snowfall. He wore a dark burgundy coat that fit him precisely, and he moved with the particular fluid grace that she had come to understand was a vamp quality, not affected but biological, the result of a body that had had centuries to perfect its own movement. He looked at her notepad. His expression did not change. "You have nerve," he said. His voice was accented in the old-world manner, Eastern European aristocratic, the kind of accent that had been polished rather than acquired. "I will give you that, Sophia Orlov. I know who you are. I know who you are as well," she said, and capped her pen. "Which is why I brought the painting in person, rather than attempting to have it couriered. I thought the gesture of delivery might open a conversation. About the guard. About Emeric Ravencourt. Yes." Valdris moved to the chair across from her and sat with that unhurried precision and looked at her the way she imagined. He looked at everything as though calculating its exact weight and worth. He is no longer under the protection of his house. The abandonment is official. Legally, under the blood law of the old accords, that makes him a ward of whatever court holds him, which is mine. The blood law of the old accords also contains a provision, Sophia said, for diplomatic witnesses. Any recognized neutral party who has dealings with both courts may petition for review of an abandoned party's status, provided the petition is filed within the 5-day window and accompanied by evidence of prior diplomatic exchange. She opened her portfolio case and produced not the commissioned painting, but a second, smaller piece, and set it on the low table between them. "I filed the petition this morning with the treaty office. The painting you commissioned is the evidence of prior diplomatic exchange. The 5-day window does not close until midnight tomorrow." Valdris looked at the petition document. He looked at the painting she had placed on the table, which was, she knew, exceptional work. It was a portrait of his court's great hall as it had been described to her, rendered in the style of the old Flemish masters, dark and luminous, deeply respectful of what his house had built. She had painted it in 3 days without sleeping, and it was, quite possibly, the finest thing she had produced in her career. He was silent for a long time. Then he looked up at her, and for the first time there was something in those colorless eyes that was not calculation. "You crossed enemy lines," he said, "for a man you have met once." "I crossed a checkpoint," Sophia said, "for a man who deserved better than to be abandoned by politics. That is either very brave or very foolish. I have been told they look similar from the outside." Something almost like amusement moved across Valdris's face. He was dangerous. She had not forgotten that for a second. But she also understood that dangerous people responded to honesty more reliably than to flattery, because they were accustomed to flattery, and it bored them. "The petition has a mandatory review period of 48 hours, Valdris said at last. "During that time, under the terms of the old accords, you are entitled to neutral guest status within this compound. You will not be harmed. You will not be free to leave, and you will not be granted access to the detained party until the review concludes." "I understand," Sophia said. Do you understand, he said, leaning forward slightly, that if the petition fails, you will leave this compound and the detained party will remain under Voscourt jurisdictions indefinitely? I understand the risk, she said. I also understand that a petition filed correctly under blood law is very difficult to deny without violating the accords that your court has signed, and I suspect, Archon Valdris, that you do not want to be the Archon who violated the accords. Not when the Ravencourt house is already watching what you do with their man. Valdris was still for a moment. Then he stood, smoothing the front of his coat with one slow, deliberate motion. Guest quarters will be arranged, he said. I will have the petition reviewed by morning. He left. Sophia sat very still until the door closed, and then she let out a breath that felt like it had been compressed into her chest for approximately 4 days, and looked down at her hands, which were, she noted with some satisfaction, completely steady. She had 48 hours. She intended to use every one of them. The guest quarters they gave her were 3 rooms on the 4th floor, furnished in the same dark, deliberate luxury as the rest of the compound, with a window that looked onto an interior courtyard and would not open. She unpacked her materials with the systematic calm of someone who had lived for years in temporary spaces, gallery residencies and borrowed studios, and the back rooms of institutions that had invited her work but not always made space for the person who created it. She set her sketchbooks on the writing desk, her charcoals in a row, her reference photographs pinned carefully to the corkboard that was apparently standard in all the guest rooms because the vampire court understood, in its ancient way, that even guests needed to work. She could not sleep. She didn't try. Instead, she sat at the desk and drew from memory, not the room, not the compound, but Emeric. She drew him the way she had seen him at the gallery, his profile turned toward the canvas, the particular set of his jaw, the way his white hair fell across his shoulder when he tilted his head in thought. She drew his hands, which she had noticed because artists always noticed hands, long-fingered and precise. The kind of hands that suggested someone who had spent centuries handling things that required care. She drew the way his eyes had looked when he turned and found her watching him, which was not startled, not guarded, but genuinely interested, as though being caught looking at him by a human painter with paint under her fingernails was the most interesting thing that had happened to him in some time. She did not let herself think too carefully about what he looked like now, after however many days in the Voscourt's lower detention chambers. She had seen the look of those chambers described in the treaty records, and she folded that image away because she needed to be functional, and grief was not functional. At dawn, or what she calculated to be dawn, based on the behavior of the staff she could hear moving in the corridor, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find not a staff member but a vampire she had not seen before, female. Young by vampire standards, meaning probably only 2 or 3 centuries rather than Valdris's apparent millennia, with the same white hair and pale eyes as everyone in this court but wearing a slightly less formal uniform. She introduced herself as Thessaly, and she said the word with the ease of someone who used it often enough not to think about how old it was. The Archon has requested you join him for the morning review, Thessaly said. The petition has been assessed by the court's legal scholar. Sophia put down her charcoal and washed her hands at the basin and followed. The review room was on the 2nd floor, smaller than she expected, lined with shelves of documents that were clearly ancient, actual parchment and leather binding, interspersed with modern archival folders. A vampire she didn't recognize sat at the main table with a stack of documents before him, and Valdris stood at the window, which gave onto the same courtyard as Sophia's room, the pale light of the filtered, light-blocked glass casting everything in amber. The petition is technically valid, the legal scholar said, without preamble, as Sophia took the chair she was gestured toward. The exchange of commissioned art constitutes diplomatic dealing under Article 7 of the old accords. The filing was within the window, the formal requirements are met. Sophia kept her face neutral. However, the scholar continued, Article 7 also requires that the neutral party demonstrate ongoing diplomatic relationships. A single commission, completed 18 months ago, may not constitute ongoing relationship under a strict reading. A strict reading, Sophia said, that has never previously been applied in a case of this kind, because cases of this kind are extremely rare. The provision exists precisely for unusual circumstances. She opened her portfolio case and produced a second document, which she slid across the table. I have also included documentation of 3 subsequent communications between myself and Archon Valdris's administrative office regarding the commission, the most recent of which was 11 days ago, when I contacted the office to inquire about delivery arrangements. Those communications constitute ongoing diplomatic exchange. The scholar looked at the document, looked at Valdris. Valdris, who had been standing at the window with his back partially turned now to look at Sophia directly. "You anticipated the objection," he said. "I anticipated several objections," she said. "I had 4 days to prepare." There was a silence. Then Valdris said, "Approve the petition," and walked out. Sophia waited until the scholar had countersigned the document and handed her a copy stamped with the Vos court seal, and then she said, very quietly, "Thank you," to the room at large, and went back upstairs to collect herself. The approval did not mean immediate release. The blood law provision gave her the right to a supervised meeting with the detained party, and then a formal hearing in 48 hours at which a neutral treaty officer would preside. She understood that. But the supervised meeting, which was scheduled for that evening, was what she needed first. They brought him to a room she had not seen before, a space that was clearly designed for supervised meetings, 2 chairs and a table with a low lamp, the kind of arrangement that was meant to feel civil while communicating clearly that it was not. She was already seated when the door opened on the far side and Emeric walked in. She had prepared herself. She had told herself in the guest quarters to be calm and professional and focused on the legal reality of their situation. She had arranged her expression for neutral competence. She had not prepared for the reality of him. He was pale in the way that vampires were always pale, but there was an exhaustion beneath it that did not belong to his kind, who did not tire easily or show strain in their faces without cause. His white hair was loose and unbrushed, and there was a mark on his jaw that she recognized as an old bruise, faded to yellow at the edges, which meant it had been sustained at least several days ago, because vampires healed quickly. His coat was gone, and he wore only a dark shirt and trousers, and he moved with the controlled precision she remembered, but more carefully. The way a person moves when something hurts that they are not going to mention. He stopped when he saw her. Completely stopped, in the doorway, and the guard behind him said something in the old court language. But Emeric did not move for 3 full seconds. Then he walked to the chair across from her and sat down, and the guard took a position at the door. And Emeric looked at her across the table and said, in a voice that was very quiet, "What have you done?" "Filed a diplomatic petition under Article 7 of the old Accords," she said. "Archon Valdris approved it this morning. You have a formal hearing in 48 hours. He was still looking at her. His silver eyes were intent and unreadable in the way she remembered. But there was something in them now that she had not seen before, something that the careful self-possession did not quite cover. "You crossed into Vos territory," he said. "Yes, alone. Yes, Sophia." He said her name the way she remembered him saying it at the gallery, with the particular precision of someone who understood that names carried weight. "They could have detained you." "They did detain me," she said. "Guest status is a form of detention. I cannot leave until the hearing concludes. But I filed the petition correctly, and the blood law is on your side, and I have documentation of prior diplomatic relationships sufficient to establish my standing." She paused. "I also brought you the painting, the one Valdris commissioned. I thought it was a reasonable leverage point." "You brought a painting as leverage. It is a very good painting." Something moved through his expression that she could not name. He looked down at the table, then back up at her, and said, "Why?" The question was simple and direct. The way he was always simple and direct, and she had known it was coming, and had thought about her answer in the guest quarters, and on the sketch pad, and in the 47 hours of sleeplessness that had preceded this moment. "Because you were left behind," she said, "and that was wrong, and I could do something about it. You could have been harmed. I am not harmed, Sophia." He leaned forward very slightly, and his voice dropped to something that was almost raw. "I am a vampire guard who has been politically abandoned by his own house and is being held by an enemy court. I am not worth this risk." "That," she said, with the particular firmness that she used when she was very certain, "is the most incorrect thing I have ever heard you say. And you said it to me the night we met, when you told me that the fourth quadrant of the great hall as I had painted it was almost right, and that was wrong also, and I corrected that too." He stared at her. And then slowly something changed in his face. The careful control did not break, exactly, but it moved, like ice that has been warmed from beneath, and what showed through was not weakness but something much more complex. And for a moment Sophia thought that if she had her charcoals she could have captured it exactly, the precise way that a very proud and guarded person looks when they have been seen. "You have 48 hours, he said at last. "Yes. Tell me the full legal position." She told him everything. She had prepared detailed notes which she produced from her coat pocket, and they spent the next 2 hours going through the petition, the provisions, the likely counter-arguments that Valdres's legal team might raise, and the responses she had already prepared. Emeric was exactly as she remembered him from the gallery, precise and engaged, his mind moving quickly through the implications of each point, asking sharp questions and listening to her answers with full attention. He found 2 weaknesses in her argument that she had not seen, and she noted both and began drafting responses. He found a provision in the accords that strengthened her position, and she added that to the filing. They worked like colleagues, like people who had been doing this together for years. And something in the doing of it settled into Sophia's chest like a warm weight, the knowledge that she had been right, not just about the petition, but about him, about the specific texture of his mind, and the way it moved alongside hers without friction. When the guard signaled that the meeting time had elapsed, Emeric stood, and so did Sophia, and they faced each other across the table for a moment. "You should know," he said quietly enough that the guard at the door could not hear, "that the house that abandoned me, it was not done carelessly. The Ravencourt political branch made a deliberate decision. There are people in my own house who want the treaty to fail because they profit from the conflict. What I am trying to say is that, even if the petition succeeds, what follows will not be simple." "I know," Sophia said, "and you are still here." "I am still here," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then he nodded once, with a gravity that felt like something much older than the gesture, and turned and walked back through the door, and Sophia stood very still until it closed. Then she went back upstairs and picked up her charcoals, and drew until her hands ached. The second day inside the Voss compound was different. See, the news that a humans had successfully filed a diplomatic petition under Article 7 had moved through the court, as news in enclosed communities always moves through every corridor before sunrise, and the texture of how the staff and guards looked at Sophia changed. Not into warmth, nothing as simple as that, but into a recalibrated assessment, the way people look at something they initially categorized incorrectly and are now reconsidering. Thessaly, who had been assigned as her unofficial liaison, found her in the courtyard at midday, where Sophia had been sketching the iron drainage architecture of the inner walls because she found it genuinely beautiful in its functional grimness, and said, without ceremony, "You are the talk of the court." "I imagine I am," Sophia said. "Vampires who have crossed enemy lines in this way are celebrated as acts of ancient honor. It is unusual when a human does it." "It is unusual when anyone does it," Sophia said, "because it is frightening. But frightening and wrong are different categories." Thessaly looked at her for a moment. Then she sat on the low wall beside Sophia, which was more informal than anything she had done previously, and said, "He is honorable, Ravencourt. He served the posting fairly. The abandonment was political. There are people in this court who know it. Are any of them people whose opinion matters to the Archon?" Thessaly smiled, which was the first genuine smile Sophia had seen from anyone in the compound. "1 or 2, she said that afternoon. Valdres sent for her again. Not for a formal meeting, but for what turned out to be, improbably, tea. He had a private sitting room adjacent to his administrative offices that was smaller and considerably less theatrical than the spaces she had seen before. Furnished in worn leather and old wood, the shelves here lined with books rather than documents. He had a tea service that was clearly European and clearly centuries old, and he poured for her with the unhurried precision of someone for whom hospitality was a genuine value rather than a performance. "You have surprised me," he said, settling back with his own cup, which he did not drink from, because she had read enough to know that vampire aristocracy sometimes maintained the ritual of tea without the requirement of the beverage. "I am not often surprised. I imagine not," she said. "The petition will likely succeed," he said. "I want you to know that I have not decided to contest it. I am telling you this not as a concession, but as a statement of where I stand. The abandonment of Ravencourt was not my decision. I was pressured by certain political elements in the treaty process to classify him as a liability rather than an asset. I did so because the political cost of resistance was, at the time, higher than I calculated the human cost to be." He paused. "I have since recalculated." Sophia set down her cup carefully. "I appreciate you telling me that. I am telling you because I want you to understand that the enemy in this situation is not who the obvious narrative suggests." He looked at her steadily. "The treaty failures have been engineered. There are people on both sides of the border who benefit from the instability. Ravencourt's posting was made untenable deliberately. His house's abandonment of him was, I believe, coerced." "Who coerced it?" she asked. "A faction within the Ravencourt house called the Sylvan Council," he said. "Old guard, they want the original isolation protocols restored. No treaty, no diplomatic exchange, no human involvement in vampire court affairs. They consider Ravencourt's interest in the treaty process and his particular interest in certain human cultural connections to be evidence of ideological compromise." She processed this. "They left him behind because they wanted him discredited, or removed from the equation permanently," Valdris said. "Yes, that means even if the petition succeeds, he goes back to a house where a faction actively wants him neutralized." "Yes," Valdris said, "which is why I am telling you this, because I believe you are planning to advocate for him beyond this hearing, and you should know what you are advocating into." Sophia looked at this ancient, dangerous, carefully honest person across his tea service and thought that the world was considerably more complicated than even her 4 days of preparation had accounted for. "Thank you," she said. "Truly." "Do not thank me," he said. "I should not have allowed the political pressure to proceed as far as it did. What I am doing now is corrective, not generous." The hearing the following morning was conducted by a treaty officer named Prevost, who arrived from a neutral administrative body with a briefcase full of documents and the air of someone who had spent several centuries being professionally unimpressed. He reviewed the petition, reviewed the counter-documents that Valdris's legal team had filed, which were, as Sophia had anticipated, minimal and half-hearted, and reviewed Sophia's responses. He asked Sophia 4 pointed questions, which she answered clearly and with documentation. He asked Valdris 2 questions, which Valdris answered briefly and without contesting the core of the petition. Then Prevost closed his briefcase and said, "The petition is approved. Emeric Ravencourt's status as an abandoned party is rescinded pending formal review by the Treaty Governance Board. He is released from Voscourt detention effective immediately, under the condition that he remain in accompanied neutral custody until the Governance Board completes its review, which I estimate will take 3 to 5 days." "Accompanied neutral custody," Sophia said. "What does that mean in practical terms?" "It means he is released to your custody as the filing party," Prevost said. "You and he will be required to remain in treaty-neutral housing until the board convenes. I have a facility available." She had not expected this. She looked at Prevost with the care of someone checking whether they had heard correctly. "My custody. You filed as a neutral diplomatic witness with prior exchange on record," Prevost said. "That grants you the specific legal standing to receive an abandoned party pending formal review. It is standard provision. Were you not aware?" "I was aware of the provision," Sophia said very carefully. "I was not certain it would be applied." Prevost looked at her over his documents with the expression of someone who was professionally unimpressed but personally, mildly amused. "It is the law," he said. "It is applied." Emeric was brought from the detention chambers to the hearing room while the paperwork was completed. He looked better than he had the previous evening, his hair brushed, his posture fully restored to its natural authority. And when he looked at Sophia, across the room his expression was composed and precise. And she watched him receive the news of the judgment, with the stillness of someone who is absorbing something significant, without allowing it to show. Then he looked at her. Just looked at her with those silver eyes that she had been drawing from memory for 4 days, and said nothing for a moment.
You filed the full provision, he said.
I filed every applicable provision, she said. Including the custodial transfer, I was thorough. Something in his face shifted in the way it had in the meeting room the day before, that movement beneath the controlled surface, and he said quietly, "Sophia." "We can argue about whether I was right to do it after we are out of this compound," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, we can." And the way he said it told her that the argument was not going to be what she expected, that he was not angry, or if he was, it was not the kind of anger that preceded a conclusion she was dreading. They left the compound 2 hours later, escorted by Prevost to a vehicle arranged by the treaty office. Sophia collected her things from the guest quarters, including the portrait she had brought as leverage, which Valdres's staff returned to her with a note in the Archon's hand. She read it in the vehicle as it moved through the city. It said, "Simply, the painting should remain with the person who made it. What I commissioned, you have already delivered." She folded the note and put it in her portfolio case and looked out the window at the city moving past. The treaty-neutral facility was a house in a part of the city that had been designated, through agreements she only partially understood, as ground that belonged to no court, a buffer zone made real in brick and plaster and old wood floors. It was comfortable without being lavish. 3 bedrooms, a sitting room, a kitchen, that was clearly never used for cooking, but served well enough as a workspace. There was a garden in the back that was walled and private. Prevost explained the terms, left them with contact information and a daily check-in requirement, and departed with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times and was already thinking about the next file. Sophia and Emeric stood in the sitting room of the neutral house and looked at each other. "You should rest," she said. "I have been resting for a week," he said, in the sense that I was given nothing else to do. He moved to the window and looked out at the garden, and she saw him test the air the way she had noticed vampires sometimes do, subtle and unconscious, assessing the space. "I understand the custodial provision better than you may expect. I know what it means for you. It means I am responsible for your whereabouts until the governance board reviews the case," she said. "It means," he said, turning from the window, "that if I violate the terms of the neutral custody, the legal consequences fall on you. You accepted responsibility for my behavior under treaty law. That is not a small thing." "I know what it is," she said. "Sophia." He said her name again in that particular way, and this time he crossed the room toward her, not quickly, but with deliberate intention, and stopped when he was close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to look up at him. She was not short, but he was tall, and the nearness of him in this smaller space was different from the meeting room in the compound, less mediated, more real. "Why?" he asked again, the same question as before, but quieter, with a different weight. "I told you," she said. "Because it was wrong. Because you were left behind, and I could do something about it." "That is the legal answer," he said. "I am asking for the honest one." She held his gaze. He was so still when he was focused on something. She had noticed that at the gallery, the particular quality of vampire attention, it did not fidget or soften or redirect. It simply stayed, and it was both unnerving and one of the most honest things she had ever experienced, because humans were almost always partially somewhere else, and he was entirely here. "I have thought about you every day since the gallery," she said. "Every day. I have drawn you probably 30 times. I have been following the treaty news and looking for your name in the diplomatic patches for 7 months, which is something I have never done for any person in my life." She paused. "And when I found out what they had done, I did not make a decision. I just started packing, and I think that is the most honest thing I can tell you about why." He looked at her for a long time. The amber light of the sitting room made his white hair warm at the edges, and the silver of his eyes was very intent. And she thought, not for the first time, that there was no adequate vocabulary for the way he looked, and she had tried to find one in charcoal and oil and water, and it had not been sufficient, and probably never would be. "I have not thought about a person in the way you are describing," he said slowly, "in a very long time. Not since before the political postings, before the treaty work. I had learned not to." He paused. "At the gallery, when I turned and saw you watching me, I thought about it for weeks afterward. You did not contact me, she said. I was a posted guard in a foreign court under a fragile diplomatic treaty, he said. The blood law of the Ravencourt house has provisions about attachment across the diplomatic line. I was not in a position to act on anything personal. You are in a position now, she said. Something moved in his face that was, she was almost all certain, amusement, the very rare kind, deep and private, not at her, but with her. I am in treaty-neutral custody, he said, under your supervision. I will make an exception to the rules, she said. He reached up and touched her face then, just her jaw, with 2 fingers, with the particular precision of those long-fingered hands she had drawn and drawn and drawn, and she felt it like a point of warmth in the still cool air of the neutral house. You are the most extraordinary person I have encountered in a very long time, he said, with the seriousness he gave everything, and she understood that it was not flattery, it was fact as he assessed it, which was how he said everything. I know, she said, which was not arrogance but honesty, and he made that sound that was not quite a laugh but was something close, something warmer, and his other hand came up to cup her face gently, and he bent his head and she rose on her toes to meet him, and they kissed with the particular gravity of 2 people who have been moving toward each other for 7 months. Through every obstacle available to 2 worlds, it was not frantic. It was careful and deliberate and deeply serious. The way everything about him was serious, and she understood in the doing of it that serious was not the same as cold, that beneath the precision and control was a warmth that was more genuine for being so carefully held. When they separated, he pressed his forehead to hers, and they stood there in the amber light of the sitting room, and neither of them said anything for a moment. The governance board review, he said finally. We should prepare for it. We should, she agreed, and did not move. In a moment, he said. In a moment, she said. The next 3 days in the neutral house were the strangest and most vivid of Sophia's life. They prepared the materials for the governance board review together, which was genuine and necessary work, and it was also, she found, the best kind of working, the kind where 2 minds with different specific knowledge functioned better together than either did alone. Emeric knew the blood law provisions and the political history of the Accords in exhaustive detail. Sophia knew how to organize and present a complex argument so that it was comprehensible and compelling to people who had not been living inside it. They built the case together on the old wooden table in the sitting room, surrounded by her sketch papers and his treaty documents, and it was, she thought, a better case than either of them would have built alone. They also talked. At hours when the work was done and the neutral house was quiet, they talked with the particular freedom of people who have nothing to lose by honesty, because they have already crossed every boundary that might have justified caution. He told her about the centuries of diplomatic postings, the particular exhaustion of being excellent at a form of service that no one else in his house fully respected, the way the Sylvan Council had been systematically isolating him within the Ravencourt structure for years before the abandonment. He told her about the old world, the things he had seen and built and lost, with the measured to someone who had made with impermanence but not with injustice. She told him about the work, the way painting vampire courts had started as a political statement and become a genuine fascination, the texture of the architecture and the quality of light in old stone spaces, the way her gallery had initially resisted the subject matter and then capitulated when the reviews came in. She told him about the Russian grandmother who had taught her to be precise, about the 4 years in a studio in Prague that had produced the work that established her, about the careful, deliberate way she had built a life that was genuinely hers. On the second evening, he sat for a portrait. She asked him once, tentatively, expecting the refusal that most people gave because they were uncomfortable under sustained visual attention, and he said yes immediately, and sat with the patient stillness of someone for whom being observed was not threatening but simply one of the things the world did. And she worked for 2 hours and produced the best portrait she had ever painted. She was certain of it the moment she saw what the brushstrokes had made, and when she turned it so he could see it, he looked at it for a long time. You see things very clearly, he said. I try, she said. That is not a technical observation, he said. I mean that you see clearly in the way that matters, without distortion from what you wish were true. Most people cannot do that. She looked at him across the easel she had improvised from the back of a dining chair. "You do it too," she said. "That is part of what I find. It is part of why I found my way here." He looked at her, and then he got up from the chair and crossed to where she was standing, and took the brush from her hand very gently and set it on the improvised palette and kissed her again, less carefully this time, with more of whatever was beneath the precision, and she wrapped her hands in the front of his shirt, and they stayed there in the lamplight until the night outside had fully deepened. On the third day, a message came from the governance board. The review had been accelerated due to the submission quality of their materials, and the hearing would be held the following morning. That evening, Emeric was quiet in a way that was different from his usual considered stillness. He stood in the garden after dark, when the light-blocking issue was moot, and she brought him tea he would not drink and stood beside him, and did not ask what was wrong, because she already knew. "Even if the board rules in your favor," she said, "you still have to go back to the Ravencourt house." "Yes," he said, "and the Sylvan Council is still there." "Yes, and they will try again," she said. "Not necessarily the same method, but they will try." "Yes," he said. He was looking at the dark garden with the particular steadiness of someone who has been looking at difficult truths for a long time. "I have been considering my options. If the board ruling restores my status officially, the Sylvan Council will not be able to act against me openly without violating the blood law themselves. It creates a legal protection, not an absolute one, but a real one, and politically," she said. "What you told me about them wanting isolation. The treaty work that you were doing was the thing they most wanted stopped." "Yes," he said. "So the answer," she said slowly, "is not just your protection. It is the treaty work continuing. Publicly, with documented diplomatic exchange that they cannot claim was irregular or compromised because it was conducted correctly and on record." He turned to look at her. "What are you proposing?" "I am proposing," she said, "that the work I have been doing, the painting of vampire courts, the documented cultural exchange, has always existed in a grey area, informally diplomatic but not officially sanctioned. If the Treaty Governance Board were to formally recognize it as an ongoing diplomatic initiative, it would be harder for the Sylvan Council to argue that your involvement in treaty-adjacent activities is ideological compromise, because it would be official policy." He was very still. "You would allow your work to be formalized as a diplomatic instrument." "My work has always been political," she said. "I would simply be honest about it, and I would need the right partnership to make it credible. A formal institutional endorsement from someone standing in the treaty structure." "You mean me," he said. "I mean someone who has spent decades working in the treaty structure and is very good at it, and who happens to understand both the legal architecture and the cultural significance of what the work is doing," she said. "If you wanted to." He looked at her for a long time, and the dark garden was quiet around them, and she watched the thought move through him, the way thoughts move through him, with full seriousness. All the implications followed out. "It would mean staying in this work," he said, "Ed. The treaty work, after everything the Sylvan Council has done. It would mean doing it in a way that is harder for them to attack," she said. "With me, formally, in the open." "Sophia," he said, with the gravity he gave her name every time. "You understand that formally partnering with me in a diplomatic initiative means you will be a target of the Sylvan Council's opposition. I have been a target of vampire court politics since the first time I painted the inside of a court chamber," she said. "I am not particularly worried about it." "You should be somewhat worried about it," he said. "I am somewhat worried about it," she conceded. "I am considerably more worried about the alternative, which is you going back into that house without adequate political protection, and me going back to my studio and painting and not knowing what is happening to you." He looked at her. Something in his face was almost unbearably open for a moment. The practiced self-possession very briefly set aside, and she thought she saw in it something that matched what she felt, which was the particular kind of certainty that has nothing to do with rationality and everything to do with recognition. The sense of having found something that fits in a way you did not know you were looking for. "I have spent many years," he said quietly, "making decisions based on what the political landscape requires, making myself smaller, more contained, more manageable within the constraints of the House's expectations." He paused. I had begun to forget that I had a preference. What is your preference? She's. This, he said. You, whatever this is becoming. I prefer it to every alternative I have been considering. She reached up and touched his face in the way he had touched hers, just her fingers against his jaw, and he turned his face slightly into her hand with a simple and total trust that made her chest ache. Then we go to the hearing tomorrow, she said, and we present the proposal. And then we build something that is harder to dismantle. Together, he said. Together, she said. The governance board hearing was held in a chamber she had not seen before, in a neutral building that belonged to the treaty administration, a high-ceilinged room of pale stone with a long table and 7 board members of mixed court affiliation, which was the treaty structure's method of ensuring that no single court could dominate the outcome. Emeric sat beside her at the respondents' table, their prepared meals before them, and she watched him in the room, the way he inhabited the space with the authority of someone who had operated at this level for a very long time and felt something settle in her, a deep and particular confidence in the rightness of what they were doing. The presentation took 90 minutes. Emeric led the legal argument with the precision she had come to expect, and she presented the cultural initiative proposal with the clarity she had spent her career building, and when they were done, the board asked 17 questions, which they answered, and the board asked 3 follow-up questions, which they also answered, and then the board deliberated for 40 minutes while Sophia and Emeric sat in a waiting area outside the chamber. He did not pace. He sat with his folded on his knees and was very still in the way she had come to understand was his version of managing tension, all that control turned inward, managing the uncertainty through patience. She sketched him on the small notepad she always had in her pocket, just his hands and the line of his jaw. And he watched her do it from the corner of his eye with an expression she had learned to read as quietly pleased. You draw when you are anxious, he said. I draw when I am paying attention, she said. They are sometimes the same. What are you paying attention to right now? He asked. You, she said without looking up from the sketch. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, Good. The board returned. The ruling was comprehensive. Emeric's status was formally restored, the abandonment classification rescinded, and the Sylvan Council's role in engineering the political pressure that led to the abandonment was noted in the official record, not as a criminal finding but as a documented irregularity, which under blood law created a protective record that would be very difficult for the Council to circumvent in future manoeuvring. The cultural initiative proposal was formally received for consideration by the treaty governance structure, which was not full approval but was official recognition, which was the first step. And finally, and Sophia had not anticipated this, the board made a statement acknowledging the role of the filing party in preserving a legitimate diplomatic resource through legally correct and personally courageous action, and recommending that the relationship between the filing party and the restored party be given formal diplomatic witness status in any future treaty proceedings relevant to the cultural initiative. Prevost, who was present, leaned over to Sophia afterward and said quietly, That last provision is unusual. It is essentially the board telling both courts that your involvement is sanctioned and your presence alongside Ravencourt is officially recognized. Is that as significant as it sounds? She asked. It is more significant than it sounds, he said. It means any action against you by any affiliated court becomes a treaty violation. It is a protection of some weight. She looked at Emeric across the emptying room. He had received the ruling with his characteristic composure, thanking the board in precise and gracious language. And now he was looking at her with an expression she was learning to read as something he did not have a word for either. Something that was partly relief and partly something deeper and warmer and less easily named. She crossed to him and he extended his hand and she took it, and they stood like that for a moment in the emptying chamber, their hands linked with the simplicity of people who have moved past the need to justify the gesture. What happens now? She asked. I go back to the Ravencourt house, he said. I attend the full council. I present the formal record. The Sylvan Council cannot move against me openly without placing themselves in violation of the blood law, and the record ensures that any indirect action will be scrutinized. He paused. It is not without risk, but it is manageable risk, not open vulnerability. And the cultural initiative, she said, will take time to build formally, he said. But the recognition is enough to begin. I have contacts in the treaty structure who will support it. He looked at her, and you have the work. What you have already built is some foundation. It simply needs the formal architecture around it. Which we can build, she said. Which we can build, he said. 3 weeks later, Sophia was in her studio in the city, the large north-facing room that was her most familiar space in the world, with its smell of linseed oil and old wood, and the particular quality of diffused northern light she had chosen specifically for how it fell on canvas. And she was working on a new piece, the largest she had attempted in 2 years, and she was not painting a court interior. She was painting the moment she had stood at the Voss checkpoint with her hands raised and her portfolio case held to her chest, because she had decided that the story of how 2 worlds could choose connection over isolation deserved to be told, and she knew no other way to tell things except through the work. The knock at her studio door came at 7 in the evening, which was when she expected it, because he had told her he would come at 7, and he was precise about things like time. She wiped her hands on the cloth she kept folded over the edge of the easel and went to open the door. Emeric stood in the hallway with his dark coat and his white hair and his silver eyes and a portfolio case of his own, which was new, and she looked at the portfolio case with surprise. "Documents," he said in response to her expression. "The formal proposal for the Cultural Initiative Review. I have been revising it based on the board's preliminary feedback." He paused. "I also brought dinner, which I cannot eat, but thought might be useful to you, given that you forget." "I did eat today," she said. "You had coffee at 11 and have not eaten since," he said. "I spoke to your assistant." "You spoke to my assistant about my eating habits," she said. "Briefly," he said. "Are you going to let me in?" She stepped back from the door, and he came into the studio and stopped at the sight of the large canvas, in the center of the room, the checkpoint painting, still rough, and in its early stages but recognizable, the composition clear, the tension of the scene already present in the arrangement of forms. He looked at it for a long time. She stood back and let him look, the way she had stood back and let him look at her work at the gallery. Because watching him see things was one of her favorite things to do in the world, and she had known that for 7 months. "You painted yourself," he said. "From the outside, from a perspective you could not have had in the moment. I reconstructed it from the compound surveillance description that Thessaly shared with me," she said. "And from what I know of how I stand when I am trying very hard not to show that I am frightened." He turned from the canvas to look at her. "You were frightened," he said. It was not a question, but it had a question in it, the kind that was asking whether she was all right with having been frightened, whether she would choose it again. "Absolutely terrified," she said. "But I would do it again in the same amount of time." He crossed the studio to where she was standing and stood close the way he had in the neutral house, and cupped her face in his hands with the same careful precision, and looked at her the way he had looked at the canvas, with full and specific attention. "The Sylvan Council met yesterday," he said. "The formal record was presented. They raised 3 challenges, all of which failed under review." He paused. "They will try again, not openly, but we will see it coming. We will be ready for it," she said. "Yes," he said, "we will." And the way he said it with that particular settled weight that was his version of certainty made it feel like a fact rather than a hope. He kissed her there in the studio, in the smell of linseed oil and old wood and the painting drying on the easel behind them, with all the careful deliberateness that was his nature, and she kissed him back with the directness that was hers. And neither of them was frantic or desperate, because they had been through the desperate part, and what was left was something better, something that had the quality of permanence about it, the particular solidity of things that have been tested and held. Later, they ate at the table in the corner of the studio where she usually spread documents and currently had 3 treaty reference texts open, and he drank nothing and ate nothing, but kept her company with his particular presence, which was more company than most people managed by trying. And they went through the cultural initiative documents together, her marking the passages that needed clearer language, and him explaining the legal provisions that needed to be demonstrated more explicitly, and it was the same as it had been at the neutral house table. That quality of two minds functioning better together than separately, the initiative was formally approved by the Treaty Governance Board 4 months later. Sophia Orlov and Emeric Ravencourt were listed as co-leads in the opening documentation, which made the diplomatic circles talk for weeks, and made the Sylvan Council furious in precisely the contained, politically impotent way that Emeric had predicted they would be, because the formal structure protected them both, and the blood law record of the Council's previous misconduct made open retaliation impossible without catastrophic consequences for the Council members themselves. The first official project of the initiative was a series of 12 large-scale paintings, one for each of the major vampire courts that had signed the accords, depicting the architectural and cultural heritage of each court in a style that was historically informed and aesthetically serious and entirely commissioned, which meant entirely sanctioned, which meant entirely untouchable politically. Sophia spent a year on them, and they were, when she looked at the finished series, installed in the Treaty Administration Building's permanent gallery, the best work of her life. Emeric attended the installation. He stood in front of each painting for the same length of time, moving through the series with the patient attention she had first seen at her gallery opening. And she watched him from across the room, pretending not to, in the exact mirror of that first evening, and then he turned and found her watching, and his expression was exactly as she had hoped it would be, deeply serious and secretly warmed. And she thought that some images were not meant to be painted because they were better held. He came to stand beside her in front of the last painting, the one of the Vos Court Great Hall, the one she had brought as leverage at the checkpoint, which she had donated to the initiative collection, and he looked at it for a long time. "You got the fourth quadrant right this time," he said. "I had better reference material," she said. "Someone described it very precisely." He looked at her, and the silver of his eyes in the gallery light, it was warm in the way that very few things were warm, without softening, warm, and still entirely exact. "Sophia," he said. "Emeric," she said. He took her hand the way he had in the governance chamber, simply and without ceremony, and held it with the specific quality of someone who holds the things they value with careful and complete attention. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to ask it correctly, because I have spent some time thinking about how to frame it." "You have spent some time on the language," she said. "I find that very endearing." "I am aware that you find it endearing," he said. "Please allow me to continue." "Continue," she said. He turned to face her fully, and the gallery was quiet around them, the other guests elsewhere in the space, the 12 paintings present in the periphery like witnesses. "What I am asking," he said carefully, "is whether you would be willing to make this permanent. Not the initiative, although the initiative is also something I hope will be permanent. I mean this. You and I, in whatever formal structure makes sense for two people whose relationship crosses every boundary that was formerly considered inviolable." He paused. "I understand that there are complexities. I am a vampire, and you are human, and the blood law does not have provisions that cover the kind of arrangement I am describing. But I have spoken with the treaty structure and with legal scholars, and there are ways to formalize a partnership that would give you legal standing in both worlds, and that would give me." He stopped. "What I am trying to say is that I would like to stop considering what I want secondary to what the political landscape requires, and what I want is you. Clearly and specifically and without qualification." She looked at him for a moment. He was holding her hand with precision, and his jaw was set with a particular controlled tension she had learned to read as emotional exposure, the specific look of someone who is uncertain about the outcome of something that matters extremely, and it was one of the most genuinely moving things she had ever seen. "Emeric," she said, with the particular fondness that his name now carried in her mouth. "I crossed enemy lines for you when I had known you for 3 hours at a gallery opening. I think my position on permanence has been established." Something in his face shifted entirely then, all the controlled tension releasing into something that was, quietly and completely, joy. The specific joy of a person who has become accustomed to managing alone and has been offered the alternative. He pulled her toward him, and she went, and he held her with the same careful completeness he gave everything. and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the cool steadiness of him, and thought that this was what permanence felt like when it was real. Not the absence of complication, but the presence of something strong enough to hold through the complications, something chosen deliberately and held precisely, and never, not once, taken for granted. "We will need to draft the formalization documents," he said into her hair. "Tomorrow," she said. "The treaty language regarding cross-world partnerships is complex," he said. "Tomorrow," she said. "There are 3 specific provisions that will require careful attention." She lifted her head and looked up at him. "Emeric?" "Yes," he said. "Tomorrow," she said. He looked at her with those silver eyes and the private warmth in them and said, with the absolute seriousness he gave everything, "Tomorrow," and kissed her in the gallery among her paintings of the courts that had tried to keep them apart, and the world that had tried to keep them on opposite sides of a line that no longer meant what it had meant before, a human artist with steady hands and a portfolio case full of leverage had decided that some distances were not acceptable and had crossed them anyway. In the years that followed, the cultural initiative grew into something neither of them had fully predicted, a living bridge between the vampire courts and the human world, documented through art and legal record, and the quiet accumulation of trust that builds when people choose honesty over convenience repeatedly and without fanfare. Sophia's work was exhibited in courts that had never permitted human work before, and the access she was granted, because of Emeric's standing and because of what they had built together, gave her a perspective no other artist had, and she used it with the precision and honesty that had always been her method. Emeric restructured his role within the Ravencourt house into something that suited what he had become over the course of the initiative work, not a post-hired guard but an advocate, a bridge figure, someone whose value was in the relationships he had built and the trust he had earned across court lines. The Sylvan Council lost 3 of its 7 members in a blood law review triggered by the formal record of their engineering of his abandonment, and the 4 who remained were too constrained by consequence to act against him again. It was not the end of opposition, it never would be, but it was the end of open danger, and the remaining difficulties were of the manageable kind. The kind that 2 people with complementary minds and genuine trust, and the willingness to sit at a table and work through documents until they found the answer could handle. Valdres sent her a commission 2 years after the checkpoint meeting. A portrait of his own court in the style of the old masters, the great hall, properly lit, the 4th quadrant rendered exactly right. She painted it over 3 months, and it was, she thought, the finest of the series, and she sent it with a note that said simply, "The provision worked," and received back a response in that precise aristocratic hand that said, "It generally does when applied correctly." On the evening of the initiative's 3rd anniversary, they stood in the window of Sophia's studio, which was also now in the informal way of people who have made permanence practical, his studio, in the sense that there was a chair at the document table that was specifically his, and a section of shelving given over to treaty archives and a secondary easel, on which she occasionally set the portraits she painted of him, which were now more than 50, and showed in their accumulation the specific and ongoing project of truly seeing a person across time. The city moved below them in the dark, and the studio was warm with lamplight and the smell of oil paint and old paper. And Emeric stood behind her, with his hands resting on her shoulders and his chin above her head, in the specific posture that had developed organically over 3 years as their version of simple closeness, and Sophia leaned back against him and felt the particular solidity of him, the cool and precise steadiness of someone who has become as familiar as the particular quality of northern light through her studio window, as fundamental as the smell of linseed oil and old wood. "Are you thinking about the work?" he said. "I am thinking about the work," she said, "and also about you. The 2 things are not separate." "No," he said, "they are not." She looked out at the city that had always been hers and thought about the morning 4 years ago when she had sat on the edge of her bed with the phone in her hand and heard his name on the abandoned list, and felt something settle in her chest with the weight of necessity, the particular feeling of knowing what has to be done. She had crossed a checkpoint with her hands up and her portfolio case full of leverage and her heart full of something she had not examined too carefully in the moment, And on the other side of the checkpoint, she had found what she had not known she was looking for, which was not only him, but the version of herself that existed in relation to him. Precise and honest, and entirely serious and fully alive. "You know," she said, "I never thanked you." "For what?" he said. "For standing in front of my painting for 20 minutes, she said. "At the gallery. That is where this started." He was quiet for a moment. She felt him breathe, the slow, measured breath of someone who does not need to breathe but does so from habit and perhaps from something like comfort. "I could not look away from it," he said. The fourth quadrant was wrong, but everything else was so completely right that the wrongness of the fourth quadrant felt personal. "You felt personally implicated in my architectural inaccuracy," she said. "I felt," he said carefully, "that whoever had painted it had seen something that most people do not see, and I wanted to know who that was." A pause, and then I turned around. She turned in his arms to face him, and looked up at him in the lamplight of the studio that was theirs. And he looked down at her with the silver eyes that she had drawn hundreds of times, and would draw hundreds more, steady and specific and entirely present. "And then you turned around," she said. "Yes," he said, "and then I turned around." She kissed him in the warm light of the studio, with the city dark outside and the paintings on the walls and the treaty documents on the table, and the whole complicated, living, improbable thing that they had built together present around them. And he kissed her back with the complete and careful attention he had given her from the first moment, as though kissing her were something worth doing, with full seriousness, which she had long ago concluded was simply how he loved things, entirely and precisely and without the diminishment of half measures. And she had decided just as long ago that this was exactly the right way to be loved. Outside, the city moved in its ordinary way, unknowing. Inside the studio, in the amber light, two people held each other in the warm knowledge of everything they had crossed to arrive here, and the story that had begun at a gallery opening and nearly ended at a checkpoint and had instead become something neither of them had found a sufficient word for continued, quietly and precisely, and with great care, in the particular permanent way of things that have been chosen and fought for and held.